Hey everyone, Connor coming to you from the World Divide. Today is December 11th, 2022. I'm just going to give a quick update on the Russo-Ukraine War as it stands right now. Not too many updates as far as like the lines haven't really moved that much as far as like offensive actions, anything like that. Both sides are conducting limited offensive actions, but it's slow, it's methodical. It's more attritional than anything. But just to give a quick run around, running from Belarus all the way down to Zaporozhye, Kherson. Starting in Belarus, it was announced yesterday, December 10th, that there would be increased military activity on the border with Ukraine. The claim is that there is a counter-terrorist threat in the area. The validity of that is likely relatively certain because there has been talk of of intervening in Belarus itself and escalating the conflicts that way. So the Belarus is just in a higher state of military readiness. They've been training with Russian mobilized forces as one military grouping under one single commander, General Surovikin. But no other updates from that region. We moved to Kursk, Belgorod, just back and forth border clashes, nothing new there. Moved down to the Kharkiv, Svatova front, between the Oskol River, Svatova, and the road running down between Kremenai up to Svatova, that region. So the Ukrainians in the last week have initiated limited offensive actions and had actually reached the road connecting Kremenai with Svatova in a town called Chernopipovka. Some of these town names, I swear, are going to kill me. But they ended up being repulsed and had to retreat back to their previous positions. And now further south, the Russians have actually activated an offensive to try to reach these. There's these two reservoirs and a small river that runs east of the town called Liman, which the Russians lost during the September Ukrainian Kharkiv offensives, where Liman was put into a temporary cauldron, and the Russians had to retreat from there. So it looks like the Russians are trying to gain ground and have better, improve their logistics and just have a better, more strategically defensible position. And I think it's best for the Ukrainians to actually withdraw from this line as well, because Russian logistics in the Kremenai region are way better than Ukrainian logistics. They have to go down through Sloviansk, come up through Liman, and then cross a bunch of dirt roads and fields and 3 different rivers to get to west of Kremenai. So the logistics and supply situation for the Ukrainians is extremely difficult there. And I think it would just be best for them to save their soldiers' lives, move back to more defensible position, and hold out there. Moving further south to the region between Seversk and Bakhmut. In recent days, in the northern flank of Bakhmut, the Russians were able to secure a town north of Soledar. Soledar is the linchpin of the northern flank of Bakhmut. There's a town north of Soledar running along the highway that goes all the way up to pretty much Severodonetsk. There's a grouping there, what we call the Charlie Group, that have been holding a line in the towns of Belogorivka, Berestove, Belogorivka, and Yakovlivka, north of Soledar. These forces have been hammered for months by artillery and weakened with attrition. And in recent days, the Russians had the initiative and were able to take Yakovlivka after previously seizing Berestove and Belogorivka. So what does this mean? So this puts Soledar in a very insecure position. Soledar was a pretty has been a pretty defensible position for the Ukrainians. The Russians have had to fight. It's like a long town that runs east to west, and the Russians have been fighting street by street up west. And there's also another suburb of Soledar, Bakhmutska, that the Russians have been very much trying to secure, in which they might actually be able to very soon, because supply and support of that little suburb is extremely challenging. Soledar is a pretty well defensible position, unless you consider a northern attack. And since the Russians have taken Yakovlivka, it opens the possibility for them to move north, take a small village of Vesele, and to severely threaten logistics coming from Bakhmut up to Seversk. And if the Russians are able to take Soledar, what it does is it will automatically collapse the front in Seversk. And then you have a northern encirclement of Bakhmut, operational encirclement. In the past weeks, Russians have made gains in the south of Bakhmut. They took Kordumivka, Oznanurivka, and they're continuing the fight for the southern suburb in Bakhmut called Opitna. There's a heavy Ukrainian fortification there that the Russians have been really struggling to take. But they've been trying to surround this fortification with a northern strike movement from Ivanograd, which is another suburb just east of Opitna. Now, another obstacle that the Russians have to overcome before being able to surround Bakhmut is a town called Klishivka. And this town is similar to one just east of Seversk called Ivanodarivka, which the Russians have been unable to capture for similar reasons, because behind Klishivka is a large hill fortification where there's deep trench networks, a lot of visibility. Basically, the Ukrainians are able to pin down and spot any movements in the region just with this one hill position. And this has been the same case with Ivanodarivka, and this is why the Ukrainians were successful in launching a counteroffensive and taking Shperna, just east of Ivanodarivka, and the Russians have been struggling to recapture it ever since. If the Russians are successful in Yakovlivka, able to collapse Soledar in the Seversk front, it negates the need to attack Ivanodarivka from the front, preventing heavy casualties. The Russians will have to pull a similar move down for Klishivka, either coming from Opitna and making a northern hook to try to attack these trenches, or I think even better, coming from Kordumivka, there's a canal that runs along the front line right now, that the Russians drive north and they're able to take Klishivka from the south. What that will allow them to do is pretty much pin down any movements, any supply support coming from Chasiv Yar and the road leading into Bakhmut, which is the main supply road, providing support for the troops in Bakhmut. The casualties there are horrendous for the Ukrainians. They're losing a battalion a day in Bakhmut. The Russians are just they're not really making too much effort to enter Bakhmut, more of an effort to just slow, methodical wearing down of the Ukrainian troops. And all they want is Ukraine to send more and more forces, for us to send more and more forces. There's a lot of foreign legions there, Polish troops, American troops, British troops, because a lot of the Ukrainian troops refuse to fight there. So morale is certainly very low, and we'll see how this situation develops. Further south, just outside of Donetsk, no real frontline updates. The Ukrainians have been heavily shelling Donetsk city. Civilians are dying. It's very tragic. And the Russians, the Ukrainians' hope is that they'll force the Russians to have to make moves, so that way they can wear them down and inflict greater casualties. Unfortunately, this tactic is being inflicted at the expense of civilians. It's horrible. Both sides are doing what they have to try to win the conflict. But no real frontline movements here. Just slow, methodical wearing down of troops. There is one thing to note. The Ukrainians did try to launch a counteroffensive in the Pishki region. It's a small fortified town just west of the Donetsk International Airport, just west of Donetsk. The Russians spent months capturing the town. 4 months ago, they captured it. They've been slowly expanding from there. They took the town of Opitne. They've been working on this town of Vadian, just west of Opitne. The goal of this entire operation around Pishki and the northern pincer further north around Krasnogorovka is to surround the largest Ukrainian fortification west of Donetsk city, which is Avdiivka. And the Ukrainian strategy has been to force the Russians to try to move, to force the Russians to try to push harder, to be sloppy, to make mistakes by shelling civilians with pedal mines, artillery, grad rockets, things of that nature. And it's really tragic, and I just hope it stops. Moving down to Ugledar, there were a couple of movements of commando groups that were stopped by the Russians. Other than that, more like skirmishes, reconnaissance, things of that nature. Zaporozhye front overall is relatively quiet. Looking into the Kherson region, just back and forth artillery duels. Nothing too much to note there. Now moving on kind of from the frontline updates, because there really isn't much to talk about, talking more about the bigger picture of the situation. And I think it's important to mention the weather. The northern regions of Ukraine are at the point where there is snowfall, the ground is frozen, and movements have become a lot easier. That hasn't really quite happened in the deep south, in like the Zaporozhye regions around Donetsk. So it's still going to take some time for the ground to completely freeze, and then when that time comes, we'll probably start to see some more troop movements. But it's unlikely in the next couple of weeks that we're going to see major offensive actions from either side in this conflict. But that's all I have for today. I'll give another update tomorrow. Catch you guys on the flip side. Thank you.